Señor Presidente, señoras.
President, ladies and gentlemen, members, dear Commissioner Najik, colleague, I've just returned from a 5-day mission to the countries of the Middle East, Arab countries and Palestine. There I witnessed the high degree of emotion with which what's happening there is being followed by all. And it ought to be possible to have a debate on what is going on there without emotion and looking further beyond towards the building of peace. It is the case that on October the 7th, the world witnessed the greatest massacre of Jews that had ever occurred since the Second World War, and then witnessed the bombing of Gaza, defined by the United Nations, or described by the United Nations as an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe, but not a natural catastrophe, not a natural disaster, but something that was brought about as a result of a blockade preventing essential supplies for the population's survival from getting through, which is another kind of massacre. Is there no interpretation, asks the speaker. Your English interpreter trusts that that can be heard.
We understand you in Spanish.
Stop a moment. Yes, please, you can continue.
Voy a pedir tiempo de descuento.
I'm going to ask for extra time. President, I was saying that I'm just back from a 5-day trip to where this dramatic conflict is underway, and that we ought to be able to get over the degree of emotion that is overwhelming those involved. We ought to be able to look further towards a future of peace, because that ought to be possible because we are witnessing the greatest massacre or pogrom of Jews since the Second World War. We're seeing how the bombing in Gaza has caused an unprecedented disaster, not a natural one, but it's been brought about by man, by humankind, because the supply of basic provisions has been stopped. The United Nations described this as carnage. And it ought to be possible to recognise the right of Israel to defend itself and simultaneously to be indignant about what's happening, for us to be indignant about what's happening in Gaza to civilians. We ought to be able to defend the Israelis' right to have a state without that meaning we'd be criticised for being partisan. It ought to be possible to criticise the policies of Israel, because governmental or countries' policies can be criticised without one's being accused of not liking the Jews. Let's not jumble things up. One thing is to criticise a country, and a different thing is to express rejection for part of the population. But I'm also saying that what one sometimes sees, the expressions are of the ugliest side of the Jewish attitude, doesn't help. When we describe them, it doesn't help the Palestinian cause. The International Court has begun investigations, and its chief prosecutor, Karen Kam, who I've been in touch with, are investigating what's going on and have sent very serious warnings to both parties, stating that Israel also has clear obligations in the context of the war that it's waging against Hamas, not just moral obligations, but also legal obligations arising from the law on armed conflict and having to do with the prevention of access to basic supplies by the population, and that every school, every hospital, every church, every mosque is an area that's protected And unless they lose that status as protected areas because they're being used for military purposes, then they need to be respected as such. And if there's any doubt as to whether a given territory or a given property has or has not lost its status as a protected place, the attacker has to assume that it's still protected by default, or show proof that it has forfeited that status, and has to make it possible for the civilians there to leave. Similarly, indiscriminate rocket attacks by Hamas against Israel are also an infringement of international humanitarian law. And I was one of the earliest people to say that preventing access of water, or access to water and electricity and staple supplies, is an infringement of international humanitarian law, and the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is saying, it's not me, he is saying, and has told Israel that it should be making efforts without further delay to ensure the access of supplies and medicines and anesthetics on the part of the civilians. The European Union is extremely concerned about what's happening. More specifically, we've expressed our concern about the attacks by Israeli settlers against civilians in the West Bank and elsewhere, and these are ongoing, and the prosecutor of the ICC has done the same. As you know, I represent the Council, and thus all member states. And you're also aware that it's not easy, because sometimes the member states have not spoken with a single voice. If you take, for example, the vote in the General Assembly of the United Nations, where 8 of our member states voted in favour of a humanitarian pause, and 4 voted against, and the rest abstained. There is a joint position in the European Council which does speak in favour of pauses, plural, and humanitarian corridors, and requests that when Israel exercises her right to defend herself, it should do so in line with the international laws on war. But to date, different leaders in Europe have expressed different views on the way in which Israel is exercising that right to defense. And when there isn't a joint position, the High Representative can't express that joint position because it doesn't exist. But he has to go on working to see that it is built. He has to try to ensure that in future the member states can converge in such a way that they can bring some geopolitical pressure to bear, geopolitical influence to bear in this conflict. And this is what we're trying to do. Fully persuaded that there cannot be a military solution to this conflict. One cannot kill an idea. The only way is to get a better idea. And the better idea here can only be to recognise that when you have two peoples that have been fighting over the same land for more than 100 years, they need to be able to live together. If the international community is committed to that, and the international community has not yet been thus. In the 30 years since the Oslo agreements, we've been repeating two-state solution. The solution is 2 states. The solution is 2 states. We've repeated that, but we've done very little or nothing to bring it about. We thought that the idea that the problem could be compartmentalized, because one side was already peaceful and the other wasn't. But this drama that's exploded has shown us that there needs to be a peace not just between Palestine and Israel, but also between Israel and Palestine. And for that to be the case, all of us, notably we Europeans, need to become committed to getting over the huge grief and pain that these events, begun by Hamas's attacks beyond its borders in Gaza, brought about. This could be the opportunity for peace to be built. And this is what the European Union wishes to do. We have put forward proposals 3 yeses, 3 noes. Gaza can't be under Hamas's control in the future. It can't be controlled by Israel in the future. It cannot be divided. 3 negatives, 3 positives. There has to be a Palestinian Authority in Gaza as well. The Israelis have to commit themselves not just to build finance construction, but we Europeans also need to be part of a solution that can only involve something that we've been expressing the need for years, which is peaceful coexistence between 2 peoples that are in conflict, which need to be able to share the same area, the same land in peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Borrell. Now, on behalf of the European Commission, Commissioner Lenarčič has the floor.